Today is January 25th, 2020, and I'm Teresa Santa Lucia. I'm on the Hanson Historical Commission. And this year, as part of the 200th anniversary, we are doing some oral histories of some of our distinguished members of Hanson. And we're just spending some time asking them to share some memories about Hanson and their time in our community. And so I'd like to turn it over to you and have you introduce yourself, and if you can give us your name, your date of birth, and where you were born.
Okay, my name is Donald Smith. I usually go by the name of Donnie Smith, and I was born in Quincy, Massachusetts, in June 11th, 1936. And we live over on 593 West Washington Street, which is the first house up from Route 14, which is County Road.
Great. Can you give me the names of your parents and your siblings?
My parents, to go back a little further than that, my grandparents, one of them came from Norway. My mother was born in Norway because her mother and father lived in Norway, and they migrated to America when my mother was like 5 or 6 years old. And my other grandmother on the Smith side, she was from Ireland, and she came to this country at one time or other, I don't know when, but my father was born in '01, and he was the eldest of the Smiths, and then they had 2 girls and a boy, which would be my aunts and uncles. And but anyhow, as far as my family goes, I was the middle boy of 3 boys, and my brother Bob, he was born in '33. I was born in '36, and Paul, the youngest, was born in '41.
Great. And what were your parents' names?
My parents' name, my father, he went by G. Douglas Smith. My mother was Ella Anderson Smith.
Okay. And did you grow up in Quincy?
No, we lived in Braintree. The pediatrician my mother had did her doctoring at Quincy City Hospital, and that's where I was born. But we lived in Braintree, and we lived on Miller Street, which is across the street going up the hill, going towards, if you were going to Weymouth Landing, mm-hmm. It'd be the first street on your left. And we lived there until we moved in Hanson in June of 1941. And the house that my parents and the next door, a lot of the places up there were owned by the bank, because that was right after the Depression and people couldn't keep their homes, and the banks took over their properties. And by then, the problems over in Europe, the Nazis were just eating up countries over there like nobody's business, and the Four River Shipyard was getting very busy because most of the politicians or people with any kind of knowledge were figuring at some point in time we were going to be in the war whether we liked it or not. And of course, we moved in June of right after my youngest brother was born into Hanson, and anyhow, and then
where did you move to? Which house did you move to? When you moved to Hanson, which house did you move to?
We lived at 379 High Street, which was almost indirectly across from the Lookout Tower.
Oh.
And one of the interesting things about the lookout tower was there was a fella.
Can you tell a little bit about the lookout tower and what that was? Yeah.
When we were kids growing up, there was a fella, an older fella. There was an outhouse there. There wasn't no plumbing. All right, and the fella that took over the lookout tower was a fellow by the name of Mr. Holland. And he was a nice old gentleman and stuff like that. And he'd let us kids come up to the tower and look out. And in the middle of the tower, it was like a trap door to get in there. And in the lookout tower, there was a map, a little bit bigger than this circle on this table, and it had a direction finder on it, and so it was a map of the town, and you could look out there, and if you could see smoke, you could position the piece that went around, and you could see where the smoke was coming from, and so you could alert the fire department. Of course, the fire department, before the war, all that amounted to was a fire chief and just call firemen. Mm-hmm. There wasn't the firemen like they are today. But anyhow, an interesting thing on that, after the war started, one thing or another, the Army came to my mother and father, because the house on High Street where I grew up, or my family grew up, it had 4 bedrooms or 4 rooms downstairs and 5 rooms upstairs. And the Army took over the top of our house. And they had people, Army officers there, living there, to man the lookout tower during the war.
And they were looking for potential attacks during the war?
Well, as you probably know, with the history and stuff like that, the Germans were coming from Germany with their submarines, and they were laying off down in the Cape and down Plymouth Way, and letting a couple of their officers, or one thing or another, go on shore and try to migrate and go within people so that they could blend in to see what was going on. I suppose that was their duty. But yeah, so they were there until, and there was and every once in a while, maybe every other week or stuff like that, the bigwigs would show up, all Army officers, and they'd go and make sure that the fellas were behaving themselves and one thing and another. And a lot of times, my mother would invite them down for supper, and we get to know quite a few of them. Some of them never shipped overseas, and some of the ones that did ship overseas, you never heard from them again. Mm-hmm. Probably they were lost in the war.
Now, what schools did you go to in Hanson?
Well, we went by there yesterday, and on Washington Street School, and there was the first 3 grades, and Mrs. Grace McClellan was the principal, and she was the 3rd grade teacher. Nice lady. And anyhow, but they did away with that quite a while ago, but then there was a piece in the paper here not long ago, maybe a couple of months ago, or a month ago, about the lady who bought the place. And they've done a wonderful job with that. They had to put all new windows in and everything else. And the the person that was that was the janitor, and he was also did the boilers and stuff like that, so there was heat, was Charlie Mann's grandfather.
Really?
And it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so anyhow, but they've done a beautiful job of that school. And then the 4th grade was the building that the Historical Society took over. That was attached by a walkway to the L.Z. Thomas School. And that was my 4th grade.
This building?
That building right there, yep.
Okay.
And then the 5th grade, they split the 5th grade up. The 5th grade, part of the 5th grade was at the L.Z. Thomas School, and the other part was in the downstairs of the town hall, and that's where I had my 5th grade.
Really?
Yeah. And so then 6th, 7th, and 8th, we're back at the L.Z. Thomas School, and then we went to Whitman High School, and I went 2 years in Whitman High School, but I couldn't get much out of it, so I transferred to Quincy Trade School, and I spent the next 3 years and graduated in '55 from Quincy Trade School. Yep.
That's great.
Yeah.
And what did you do after high school?
Well, I worked on your grandfather's mowing machines because lawnmowers, and I.
You've worked on my husband's lawnmowers too.
Yeah, that too. But that was back in 1955, and I worked for Henry Domestico,
Okay.
which his place was right next door to where the Cafe Deli is now.
Yep.
Okay, and I worked there for like 3 years, and anyhow, the person that was the motivating person why we came into Hanson was a person, him and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. York, Frank York and his wife, Doris, and they lived next door to us on Miller Street. And he worked in Boston, and my dad worked in Boston. And anyhow, so he was saying, there's a nice little town, and you're going to have to move anyhow because of the war effort coming along. And so anyhow, my mother and father looked around, and they looked at 2 or 3 properties in Hanson until they decided to move in to the High Street house. And anyhow, there was no heat in the place, and you had kerosene heaters, and one thing, and like there were 3 chimneys, and each one of the chimney had the kitchen had a Glenwood stove in it that was all cast iron, but it wasn't wood or coal. They had fixed it over so it was kerosene. And anyhow, so we stayed there and made the best of the first couple of years until my father could put central heat in and put a steam boiler in, and was coal, and so that we stayed there, and it worked out quite well. Yeah.
Now, when did you meet your wife?
The person that got the family interested to coming down Hanson, he was the head of the Linotype people, and he worked for the Christian Science Monitor. And anyhow, he knew I was a little unhappy working for the lawnmower shop because the fella hated to spend, didn't want to come up and give me too much money. So anyhow, he was saying there was a fella that he knew, a very good friend of his, that was starting a weekly newspaper down in Pembroke. And they were looking for an apprentice. And so I went and interviewed him. His name was Bill Fragel. Anyhow, I talked to him and stuff like that, and I got to work for him, and that's where the Silver Lake News was printed, and I worked for him. And of course, I know nothing about printing, but I guess between him and a couple of the other fellows, they learned how to use, set type and this, that, and the other, and anyhow, and how to, at that time, there wasn't any automatic printing presses. It was all hand-fed.
Right.
And you had to get a little air underneath the sheet, because the sheet was like 4 feet by 3 feet wide, and you had to give it a little air underneath it so you could bring it down to the guide, and then the fingers would pick it up, and it would revolve around the cylinder as the bed was going back, and that's how we printed. And it was hot type at that time. And I worked for there until...
What year was that you started?
And that was, I worked there, it must have been 1958, I think it was. And then we did a lot of job printing too. And one of the ones we did was the county fair for the Congregational Church down in Halifax. And the lady that brought over all the materials was a lady by the name of Doris Hoinghouse. And she was the town clerk for the town of Halifax. And so she came over with all her stuff so that we could put it in the little booklet that we made. And anyhow, the owner says, "Hey, you got any girls down there that would like to meet this fella here, one thing or another?" And so she says, "Let me think about it." And anyhow, when we had all the brochures done and stuff like that, the booklets, and she said, "Yes, I think I know somebody that Donnie would kind of like very much. We'll see what happens." And so anyhow, they had their annual chicken barbecue from the church, which they had it all set up in back of the town hall, because the town hall and the church are side by side down in Halifax anyhow. And so I went down there to meet her, and I didn't know who the heck it was, and her name was Patty Bedour. And so anyhow, she went, because she went, Halifax kids went the 7th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, they went to Whitman for the junior high because Halifax didn't have one. And then she went to Whitman High for the first 2 years, and then that's when Silver Lake in Kingston opened up. Mm-hmm. And anyhow, then she went the last 2 years down there, and she graduated in 57. And so that's how I met her. And we kind of liked one another. We still do, and this year, June 25th, will be our 60th anniversary.
Wow.
We still like each other, too.
Congratulations.
Which is a plus.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So that's how I met my wife.
That's wonderful. Now, how long did you date before you got married?
Well, it must have been, I think we probably, maybe a couple years anyhow, maybe 2 or 3 years, and then we got married the 25th of June in 1960. Yeah.
That's great. And when you got married, did you move into the house in Hanson, or did you on West Washington Street?
No, we did not. We rented a place. She worked over just down the street here at the Commonwealth Shoe and Leather. Just right around the corner is where the Bostonian shoe was manufactured, and she was a stenographer there. She had a real good job, but one of her girlfriends, in fact, one of the girlfriends were part of her wedding people, and one of the bridesmaids. I'll get it right yet. Anyhow, they were having a house built in Halifax, because she was from Halifax too. So anyhow, they were vacating the house on Liberty Street, and so we said, well, I'll see if we can move in. So they left, and we moved in, and that was 269 Liberty Street, and so that was indirectly across from where McDonald's is now. And the house is still there. And so it was a nice place. The fellows by the name of Walter and Al Bazanson, two brothers, they owned the place, and they were so nice. And we stayed there until we bought the place in West Washington Street. Okay. And the place we bought in West Washington Street, man, one of the fellows told me, and when we had a whole new 200 amp electrical put in, and they were from the same place that I worked in Boston, and they said, you know, you would have been smart to take a bulldozer to this place and bulldoze it over, but we didn't. We repaired it all, and we took out all the old hair plaster and laths that were there. There wasn't a nickel's worth of insulation in the whole place. Any insulation were maybe a couple of mice nests, and that was about it. But we insulated the whole place, put all new wallboard up, like I say, new electricity, and had to put all kind of new plumbing in and stuff like that. And in fact, one of the fellas, a friend of ours, the Bakers lived there. And Paul Clemens and I, and Chet Kolatz, and Ronnie Baker, we had pigeons. And anyhow, we'd take the pigeons, they were homing pigeons, you know, and so like where Steve Campanelli has now. And so we'd take them and we'd ride our bikes up to Whitman, let them go, and of course they'd beat us back, you know. But anyhow, we had a lot of fun there. Yeah. But the Bakers moved, they moved out, and they moved back. They went to California, to the San Fernando Valley, and the first year they drove back to say hello, and then we never see them after that. They were, I don't know if they're still with us or not, you know.
Yeah.
Because as you get older, there were a lot of people that are no longer with us.
Yeah.
And so you're thankful for the time you've had, really, you know.
So can you tell me the name of your children and how old they are, and whether they
we have three boys. We had our first baby was born in when we lived over on Liberty Street, but she today she probably would still be alive, but she only lived 2 or 3 days because her lungs weren't developed, and so we lost her. And so, it devastated my wife, something terrible. But anyhow, one of the ladies that was her boss over the Bostonian Shoe made a visit to our house on Liberty Street one day, and she says, "You're coming to work with me again." She says, "We've hired a couple of college girls to do your job, and they can't do it, so we're going to give you more money than we gave them, and you're coming back to work. So she had a real nice job there. She, correspondence and writing letters and stuff like that. And so that's where she did well. But anyhow, our firstborn, David, was born in 63.
Okay.
He's the oldest. And then in 67, Peter was born. And then in 69, Michael was born. So we have the three boys. David lives in Middleborough on Route 28, and Peter lives in Pembroke on Greenwood Ave, which is right out of the center of town, right off of Route 36, which is Center Street. And then Michael lives over in Halifax on Walnut Street, just before you get to the fields where over by Oak Point. Before you get to Oak Point, he lives over that way. And Peter, they're all smart kids in the area. Michael, the youngest one, he works for Harvard. He does heating, ventilating, and air conditioning, and he got a job over there, and he's been over there for 15 years. In fact, him and one of the fellows that he knows, they just put a new boiler in our house because he says, Mom, you need a new boiler. That thing's making bad noises. So anyhow, they just put that in, and so keep the house warm for a while.
Right,
yeah,
right.
While we're still here.
Now, what are some of your favorite places in Hanson?
My favorite place is where I live, believe it or not. We have enough land. In fact, the youngest one, Michael, tells us we have too damn much land, but it's only 2.5 acres. It isn't like your family. Your family has all kind of acreage, and I know your grandmother broke it all up so all of her children have a portion of the properties, which is nice, but anyhow, we have a garden, and which I enjoy. It was funny, when I was growing up, that was when they had during the war, you grew vegetables so you could eat in the wintertime. And so what we had for like green beans or carrots or whole tomatoes and that kind of stuff, my mother would process it and would put it downstairs in the pantry downstairs. So in the wintertime, you had something to eat, because at that time, there wasn't any supermarkets around. There were 3 markets in town, and they were just grocery stores. One of them was across the street from where Layton's funeral home is now. That was the Hanson Public Market. And anyhow, then the next one was down Clark's store, which is down by where the railroad station is now, or was in there too. And then the other one was Walkie's store, which is where 58 and 14 liquor stores is now. That was part of that. And so that was the only, but when I know my father and mother, they used to, the only market there was to speak of was one in Whitman, where the dollar store is now. And the other one my mother used to do was over in Rockland, and it was a First National store, grocery store, and that's where Bagnell's part store is, just after where the Rockland train station used to be. Because there's no trains there now. The tracks are still there, but that's as far as it goes.
Yeah.
That was interesting living in town, No.
Now, used to see you walking all over town. You used to be a
I
big
do enjoy
walker.
walking.
Yeah.
I really do.
And
Yeah.
what's some of your favorite routes to walk in Hanson?
What's that?
What's your favorite route to walk in Hanson?
What I usually do, it depends how ambitious I am that day. Last year, I ended up with the flu. We both got the flu shot, and I got the flu, and she got the flu, but it knocked me on my pants, and I ended up in the hospital, up to South Shore Hospital, and I was up there for maybe 4 or 5 days, and I came home. And anyhow, we have a dog, thanks to our grandson. Anyhow, the dog, my wife wanted me to get the dog run closer to the house. So I had one of those, you screw it. It's got like a screw, and you screw it in the ground, so it's a good anchor. And anyhow, I moved it around, and anyhow, I had the dog, and trying to get the dog in the house, and the dog had, instead of going on the right of me, he went to the left of me, and when I stepped back, I tripped, and I fell against her flower bed, and I broke 4 ribs.
Oh my goodness.
And so I was back in the hospital again. And so I was there for probably another week or so. And so it's taken me almost a year to get back where I was before I got sick. So I don't walk as much as I used to walk, but a lot of times what I'll do, I'll go up County Road, and then I'll walk up there, and if I need anything at the grocery store that I can carry, I'll go there and get like milk or what the wife might need, and then walk back. But I used to walk up Home Street to High Street to Liberty Street to back to West Washington Street and home. But I don't do that anymore because the back of the legs aren't as good as they used to be.
Yeah.
Oh.
So this year is the 200th anniversary, and there are a bunch of activities planned and events, and I was just wondering if there are any events that you remember in your time here in Hanson that stand out as things that you particularly enjoyed, or...
Well, you know, years ago, there wasn't the Little League. You know, today they do so much more for the children than they used to. The only time we played ball is in a vacant field and stuff like that, because there was the only field that was a playable field was the Legion field, and that was just for the Junior Legion baseball team. And but now there's 3 or 4 places around, and even Botieri's gets bigger and bigger up there, the playing fields, which is great for the kids because there wasn't a whole lot to do. And of course, we made our own entertainment, just about, you know. I had a paper route. My older brother Bob, he had the paper route, and we went from the county hospital all the way down to Walkie's store. But of course, at that time, there wasn't half of the houses that there are now. What used to be vacant fields is houses now.
Right, yeah.
So anyhow, then when he was going to high school, then I took over the paper route. And then when I started going to go to Quincy, to go to the trade school in Quincy, I had to get up early in the morning and get the first train out of South Hanson, and they'd drop me off, the train would, in Quincy, and then I'd go to school, and then I'd have to wait until 10 minutes of 5 in the afternoon And that was the first train that came from Boston that went down to Plymouth. And so so for 2.5 years, I took the train. And then the last half a year, I bought a 41 Ford Coupe. And I took that back and forth to Quincy till I graduated. Yeah.
Can you tell a little bit about the train, what the train was like back in that day?
Well, years ago, that was a steam train. And now all of them now are diesel trains. And as I recall, there was a turnaround in Whitman. And the train, because now the diesel trains they can go just as fast backwards as they can forward. And so all they do, they just hitch them up, and they don't have to turn them around, because sometimes you'll see the locomotive comes through, and then sometimes you'll see the locomotives on the back of the train, So, but anyhow, yeah, it was interesting. Go down, I'd ride my bike down to South Hanson in the morning, or once in a great while, my mother would take me down, because back in '51, my father died. And so anyhow, my mother never had a license, and so she had to get a license, and she finally got a license. And anyhow, the first couple of years after my father died, it was slim pickings. If it wasn't for the church giving us a load of coal to heat the house, I don't know what the heck we would have done, The neighbors, especially Mrs. Brooks, which was Marcus Sheeran's daughter and Joanne Estes' mother, the Brookses, and like I say, and the Yorks and the Puddingtons, they were just so good to us after my father died. But anyhow, she got a job. They was looking for someone she looked around, and someone said, well, the Hanson Credit Union was down right across the street from Clark's store, which is across the street from Benny Kaplowski's drugstore, which is the Rexall drugstore. Anyhow, so she got a job at the Hanson Credit Union. And the Hanson Credit Union, I think the principal owners were some of the businessmen in that area, which would be Mac McDonald and maybe Clark's and Lyman Smith, who had an appliance store there. And I don't know if Benny Kaplowski had anything to do with it. But anyhow, they had a credit union there and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, the Rockland Trust bought them out. And the Rockland Trust was there for a year or so until they put the building up right next to Walkie's store, and which they just remodeled it this year. It looks nice.
Yeah.
And so she worked there, and she worked herself up. And when she retired as the head teller. And anyhow, so, and of course then, the rest is almost history, and stuff like that. But yeah, it was interesting,
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Is there any particular location in Hanson that you enjoy visiting? Whether it's Camp Kewanee or whether it's Burridge Pond, or is there some place in Hanson that
years ago, things have changed climate-wise, as you well know. But when I was growing up, I was a teenager and stuff like that, and right after Thanksgiving, it would get cold, and it would stay cold all winter long. And on Wampatuck Pond, there were 3 ice boats there, and 2 of them, one of them was owned by Elton Smith, because he lived on the house. His wife was a hairdresser. Tessie Smith was her name, and they lived across the street from the Gad Hitchcock house, which is where Mr. and Mrs. Walkie owned. Anyhow, and he had an ice boat, and his stepson, which was Ike Estes, he had a ice boat there too. And then we're going up on Liberty Street. The Sleepers, old Myron, there was old Myron Sleeper, which was the father, and then Myron Sleeper was the same age as my brother Bob. They had an ice boat, and when the ice was thick enough, they'd bring it down, and they would put it in the pond, and there was always kind of, skating activity and everything else. Today, you'll get maybe a week of cold weather, and the ice isn't thick enough to support people. And that you read in the paper or put the TV on, and you think people, they say it's ice, but it's only maybe an inch or less thickness, and of course, bad news can happen then. But years ago, I can remember they'd be out there. The darn ice fishermen would cut a hole in the ice, but they'd leave the clump up on there, where they dug a hole, And so, anyhow, you wouldn't want to hit that with the ice boat,
right?
Because it was fun, because it'd be colder than all get out, and if you had a little bit of wind, you'd be surprised how fast those ice boats would go.
So it's a boat that sits on top of the ice?
It's like a tricycle in this respect. It has a front runner, and then it has two side runners, and then it has a mast with a sail. And the whole thing is, with the mast and the sail, is you try to catch the wind with the sail, which propels you.
Yeah. Yeah. And how many people could sit in the boat at any one time? One person.
It was just like a cockpit.
Yeah.
The one that the Sleepers had, it had like steel with canvas, and it was like you laid there. It wasn't a sit-up position; it was a lay-in position, and the ones with the tricycle type of ice boat, they had a steering wheel, and it would regulate the front wheel, the front cutter, and anyhow, but the other one had a tiller on the back, and it was more like a boat rather than an ice boat. But what a heavy old thing that was. Took him and his old Myron, it would take almost all day to bring the thing down, because you had to bring it down in pieces. But we had a good time. It was nice then,
Yeah.
And even after then, when I lived up on High Street, I had an old Model A Ford, and we'd come down, we'd go down by Bob Walkie lived across the street from me, of us, or there, and we'd go to Walkie's field, and we'd get down to the county hospital where the sewer beds were. We'd end up there, get out there, and then we'd go down to where the end of their property was, and you could go out, and we'd take the cars, and we could go on the bus. We'd go out on the ice with the cars and go down to, it was a little restaurant there. It's where there's a real estate dealer there now, but that was Sal Vera's restaurant.
The one next to the town hall?
Right next to Conway Country.
Yeah,
right there.
It used
that
to
was
be a
Sal
meat
Vera's
market.
restaurant.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and we'd stop in there, we'd go in, and some of the locals would be in there, and we'd have a cup of coffee or one thing or another, a donut, one thing or another, and then get back on there. God, if we did it now, the the environmental police, the regular police, and everybody else will be on our rear end. But we had a good time, yeah. No, but we never went through the ice.
Yeah.
We were smart enough, you know.
Right, right. Well, that's amazing. Yeah, the interview right before us with Mr. and Mrs. Powers,
Yep.
they were talking about bringing their children down to the town hall pond and how the whole town would show up and ice skate. And
It would.
yeah, it hasn't happened in a long time.
No, well, there's no ice.
There's no ice, right? Yeah.
You know, they think this global warming is a lot of baloney, but it isn't.
Yeah.
Because, like I say, we don't get the cold winters we used to.
Yeah.
We get a little bit of it, but it doesn't stay.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So we have about 5 more minutes. Is there anything that you any story that you would like to tell about Hanson, or any other memory that you have you'd like to share?
Well,
I'm sure you have many, but
Yeah.
is there one that's right on the top?
No, I don't think there's anything that comes up at the top of my head right now, other than, like I say, we had a good time. Paul Clemens and I, he was our next door neighbor years ago. He lived up on High Street, and we used to go fishing, and where get up on top of where Home Street hits High Street, there was wild blueberries there. And we used to go over there and pick blueberries for my mother and that and stuff like that, bring them home. She'd make cakes and muffins and one thing else like that. And you know, as I started to tell you about during the war years, we had a garden. And my father, of course, worked in Boston, and so he would...
And what did your father do?
He worked at Kidder Peabody Company, investment company.
Mm-hmm.
He worked in there for years. My mother said he always could make money for other people, never for us. but anyhow, he'd say, well, you know, we'd plant the garden. There was a fella live up next door to where the Belanges lived, up on High Street, which is, there was our house, and then there was Norman McDonald's house, who owned McDonald's coal and oil, and then the next house was Prurio's house, which was Mrs. McDonald's brother and his wife, Prurio's, and then the next house was Willis. In the Willis house, he had a plow and a tractor, small tractor and a plow, and he used to come down and plow our garden, and then my father and mother would plant it, and it was my job and my brother's job to keep it weeded. And it was like pulling teeth. I hated to weed. I'd sit there and I'd pick a weed and I'd be cussing to myself. I'd rather be fishing than pulling weeds, you know. And my brother Bob, he'd get out there in the morning and he'd pick the weeds and clean it all up and everything else. And he was Mr. Goody Two Shoes, and I didn't want to do it, you know. But anyhow, now, it's funny, now where I live now in West Washington Street, I have learned that you have to lighten the soil so you can pick weeds a lot easier. So what I've done is where the sanding trucks go by in the wintertime, they'll put sand all over the side of the road. And I'll take the sand, put it in my wheelbarrow, and put it in my garden. Because when we first started living there, back in '64, we planted carrots, and nice red carrots. You could see just a little bit of them. But the only thing is, because where we live, same as you, we have all kind of clay there, and clay being so hard, the carrots wouldn't go in too good. So if you lighten up the soil, all of us now, I have good carrots because the soil is loose so the carrots can grow. Before, all it'd be, the carrots would be about that long, you know, because there's no place to grow.
Right.
But anyhow, so I've learned that now I'll go out there, and it's just heaven to go out there. You hear the cars going by, and I'm picking the weeds out of the carrots, because when they first come up, the weeds are bigger than the carrots, and so you have to be very gentle about getting the weeds out and stuff like that. But I enjoy going out there now because nobody bothers you. You know, a couple planes go by, and because where we live, you live on the same street. At 4 o'clock, 4:30 at night, the cars, they back right up from where the intersection, where the blinking light is, all the way almost up to your house, because there's more and more traffic. It's unbelievable how much traffic there. When I first went to work in Boston, to get back to where I was when I worked at the Silver Lake News, back in '62, they sold the place. They sold it to a couple of fellas from the Herald Traveler. They bought it. And anyhow, this is when they were just starting to go out of hot type into more or less photograph type. And so anyhow, here's my wife. She's pregnant. We're going to have our first baby. And the people that own the place said, well, I might be able to give you a day or two a week work. And I said, 2 days a week isn't going to put food on the table, you know. So this fellow that was instrumental in moving to Hanson, Frank York, says, Donnie, they're looking for a printer up where I work. And he says, I think you'd fit right fine in there. And so thanks to him, I got the job, and so I had to start going back and forth to Boston. When there was a fellow lived in Halifax, down in the Halifax beach section there off of Lincoln Street, and he worked in the press room. So him and I started going back and forth to Boston. And back in '91, they offered him, and they were cutting back on the help and stuff like that, so they offered us a pretty good package. If you had been there 30 years, which I had, he had been there a little longer, so we got the golden handshake, and in '91, they've been paying me since '91 not to go to work. It's been a wonderful thing. So that's when I started my little lawnmower shop over the shop.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I've enjoyed that too. But this past year, I pulled up my sign because I'm cutting way back. I'm starting to enjoy some of the stuff that I'm not saddled to do. I can do what I want now, more or less. You know?
Like weeding your carrots.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Weeding your
But a lot of the people that you and your husband and some of the other relatives of yours, they still come, and which is fine. It gives me something to do, and not only that, I like to talk to people too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming and doing this interview with us. It's been so fascinating to hear some of your stories.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
It's been
Donnie.
a pleasure. Yeah.
Right.